Helen Flynn and I work at the Human Rights Consortium. I'm the Human Rights Officer there, and part of my job I would have the responsibility for the international standards and the engagement, particularly with UN monitoring mechanisms. The Consortium itself, as an organisation, we advocate for a human rights space in Northern Ireland, and in that we include what we call a strong and inclusive Bill of Rights. By strong and inclusive, when we're talking about that, we're talking about we want to see the international standards that we have for human rights brought into domestic legislation so that they're available for people domestically. And the Consortium itself, we have a membership of about 160 organisations, and they're every type of group you can think of: charities, NGOs, grassroots community groups, your trade unions, from right across every part of Northern Ireland. So it's a really broad and diverse membership. The main international instrument that we would get involved with is ISESCR, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But we also, in the last cycle in 2019, we did get involved with CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Traditionally, we would have left CEDAW to the Women's Policy Group lead on that, but just we felt that 2019 was a pretty special year because Brexit was taking up so much attention, and we had done a lot of specific work on how Brexit was going to impact women. So we offered the Women's Policy Group, well, if you'd like, we'd write a report that focuses more on Brexit. And so we did contribute to the report in 2019, but its economic, social and cultural rights would be our mainstay. For us, international standards, I mean, they're not always a direct tool for change, but we always talk about how they're a really important arrow in your quiver, or, tool in your toolkit in order to achieve change. And there are some very specific examples of how they achieve change in Northern Ireland. So one of the ones I talk about is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So up until 1997, there was no race relations legislation in Northern Ireland. There was in Great Britain, but it hadn't been brought across to Northern Ireland. And in, I think it was 1993, for the review of the UK and Northern Ireland under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, it was raised that there was no race relations legislation, and that was something that the committee talked about. And you can see a direct link between that and between Northern Ireland actually getting that race relations legislation. The other real clear example, particularly for women in Northern Ireland, has been, of course, the inquiry by the CEDAW committee, which has led to the change in our law here being based upon the results of that inquiry. And although there's still a lot of work going on the ground, and a lot of activists are still having to push because the services haven't been commissioned and we haven't seen the sex and relationship education come in, the point is for me that the UK governments, the changes they are trying to put in place are based upon what the CEDAW committee have called for. So for me, that's really important as well. So as I say, international standards for me, it's not always something that will cause direct change, but it's a really important tool in the toolkit of activists and organisations seeking change in Northern Ireland. There would be 4 key issues that we would address in any shadow report, or at least this is what I would write. I would write on 4 key issues. The first is the need for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. That was something that was agreed to in our peace agreement in 1998, and it was seen in a society moving on from conflict, where a lot of the conflict was based around rights issues, that it was a way to say never again and to guarantee a better future for people, something that they could trust in. And for me, that's become even more important as we go through constitutional change once again, through the Brexit process would be for me the main thing that's massively changing our constitution at the minute. And I think at times of change like that, having bills of rights with strong human rights standards is really important to give people something that they can feel is kind of a safety blanket, that they know their rights will be protected, respected and fulfilled. So we talk about the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. We also talk about current threats to human rights. For the CEDAW process and for the past few years, the 2 huge threats that I would see is that the Conservative Party have made no secret about the fact that they would like to see the Human Rights Act repealed. So for me, there's a real need to preserve the Human Rights Act, and I can talk a bit in a minute, if you'd like, about how the Human Rights Act specifically has been used to protect rights for women. And on top of that, the other big threat is Brexit. The EU is not without its problems. It's very much founded on neoliberal principles, but for women in Northern Ireland, and particularly for pregnant people in the workplace, the EU has had a huge impact on producing a really thickening of equality for women here. So Brexit has been a huge threat to our rights. That was the other thing that we wrote about. The other two things, though, that I always write about are education. So the Northern Ireland Act makes it clear that responsibility for international standards lies with Westminster. However, as people know, the actual day-to-day realisation of human rights tends to happen within public authorities, within departments in Northern Ireland when you're talking about your rights to health, your rights to education. So for me, a big thing that I always write about in these reports is the need for education of our public officials and authorities about what their actual duties are and about how they can fulfill them. And then the final thing I write about is the need for the UK government and the government in Northern Ireland to fully immerse themselves in these reporting processes. You know, it's not something that every 4 or 5 years you just write a report and forget about it. We should be, as civil society, engaging with the government, and the government should be open to engaging with us right throughout the process. So whenever you write the report and then you have the review, you then get the concluding observations, and spending time throughout the cycles, not just putting those concluding observations or recommendations to bed for another few years, but actually working out ways that we could progress those. And so just basically for the UK government and the Northern Ireland government to be fulfilling their responsibilities and having a cycle that works for everybody. So those would be the 4 things that I would really write about when I'm engaging with the monitoring mechanism. So when you first started talking about human rights and the discourse became really popular, you know, post-World War II, you kind of saw 2 schools of very separate rights. There was economic, social and cultural rights, and there were the civil and political rights. Behind that, you have this new generation of rights of, you know, environmental rights and community rights coming up. But increasingly, the discourse has kind of realized that all rights are completely interdependent. And for me, human rights are about an ecosystem. So everything has to be in place for everything else to work. So for example, when I wrote the report, the shadow report for CEDAW, one of the things I was looking at was how the Human Rights Act has helped women in Northern Ireland. The Human Rights Act brings the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic legislation in a limited way. But the European Convention on Human Rights is traditionally seen as a civil and political rights document. But I was actually looking at it in terms of things like the Lorraine Cox case. Lorraine Cox had a life-limiting condition, but she didn't qualify for benefits because she wasn't being told that she had a life expectancy of 6 months or less. That was seen to be contrary to the Human Rights Act and her human rights. But why that was so important for me in terms of how it impacts women was the fact that Lorraine was a single mother. So these benefits, and it's generally women we see in Northern Ireland who are single parents. So how that ruling and how the lack of access to benefits impacts differently on this group who are single parents. So it not only helped the rights of the child, but it helped this grouping of single parents who particularly tend to be women. So that's something that I'm fascinated in how we can use civil and political rights, for example, to stretch out into the socioeconomic or into women's rights, into things like race and gender. Because for me, a lot of the kind of barriers that have been put up or the classifications are becoming more redundant as we better understand that, as I talk about that ecosystem of how human rights actually function. The Human Rights Act was a piece of 1998 legislation, came into force in 2000. And what it did was it brought the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic legislation. So what that means is before you had the Human Rights Act, if you wanted to realise your rights under the European Convention, you would have had to go to Europe to take your case. We have some really, really brilliant examples, such as Jeffrey Dudgeon's case that he took to Europe eventually saw the end of the criminalisation of homosexuality in Northern Ireland. Like, that's such a powerful case. But to ask an individual to have to go to court in the first place to realise their rights, and secondly, to have to go to court all the way over in Europe, is a massive ask of any individual, and particularly one who's in possibly a very vulnerable situation because their rights are being breached. What the Human Rights Act did was it put a duty on all public authorities to realise the rights within the European Convention. So it's a really important for me two-stage process. The first stage being that public authorities and the government should be making laws and fulfilling their duties in a way that's rights compliant. So hopefully there's a lot less breaches of rights. But the second part that's really important is that if your rights are still being breached, you are able to take legal action. So you are able to go to court, but you don't have to go all the way to Europe. You can go to your domestic court and have your rights realised. And you will have, so for example, I talk about the Lorraine Cox case, but you will have organisations such as the Law Centre who can help people with that realisation of rights so people aren't on their own. So that's really important for me, the Human Rights Act, in making rights real and bringing them home. Because if rights are something that just exists at a very high level, or you have to cross a lot of hurdles to get to them, then they're not really worth the name of human rights in a lot of ways to me. There's also there's a differential in how rights are protected across the different nations that make up the United Kingdom. So, for example, Wales has already brought some aspects of the Convention of the Rights of the Child into their domestic legislation in terms of how decisions are being made. And Scotland's also in the process of actually going a bit further with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But what's also really interesting for this particular piece is that Scotland have now proposed a human rights bill. And the Human Rights Bill will bring into domestic legislation the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Convention on the Elimination of racial discrimination, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So those are 4 really key UN treaties that normally just exist at an international level, but that Scotland is trying to bring into their domestic legislation. That means the aim of it is that all laws being made in Scotland, all actions by public authorities will have to abide by the provisions within those conventions. That's really exciting. And on top of that, there's going to be processes for reporting so that it's not just that the Scottish government has to abide or you can take action, legal action can be taken if they don't. But the Scottish government is also going to be checking in on itself and seeing what it's doing and seeing if it can do better. For me, that's a really, really healthy process. So it's been great to see those advances in Scotland. And Northern Ireland has in its back pocket this provision for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland that's to be done through Westminster legislation. So potentially, if we were to bring international standards in through a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, it would actually have power to go further because it would be Westminster legislation rather than legislation of a devolved power. So that's really, the Scottish developments are really exciting. And we currently have an ad hoc committee on a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland in our Stormont Assembly. And I'm really hoping that we can learn some of what's happening in Scotland and progress with that. One of the things that's really different for me about CEDAW, and one of the things that was so progressive about CEDAW, is that I had talked about different generations of rights. But another layer of that is that human rights were seen as things that happen in public spheres. And what CEDAW did was it really broke it down that actually human rights are things that also happen in private spheres. And you've already spoken to Emma and to Kendall, who spoke so much about domestic violence and the impact that has in women's lives. So for me, CEDAW is this really powerful instrument in that it says that human rights and the protection of rights are things that we also have to look behind the closed doors at what's going on. And for me, again, that's a really brings this much more holistic aspect to human rights, so that the law is trying to reflect better people's actual lived experiences, and that's really important. And again, for me as well, human rights aren't perfect. You constantly have to be open to evolve and to change and to do better.